Hey guys, I have artist block, so today we're doing a fan build. I've had this scene stuck in my head for a really long time, and it's a scene from Lord of the Rings. It's where Arwen is trying to escape with Frodo as she's being chased by ring wraiths through the forests and the mountains, and she comes to a river, and the ring wraiths are just like, "Give us the halfling," and then she's like, "If you want him, come and claim him." Iconic. I love this scene, but it's gonna be a little bit tricky to tackle, and that's why I've been putting it off for so long. The first thing I'm gonna attempt to tackle is the horse, and I'm using this steel wire to make an armature, and I've stuck it into this cork stopper because somebody recommended that, and actually that was a great idea. Over the past few projects, I've been trying to get better at sculpting. I've been adding more figures into my dioramas, and I've been trying out more techniques for starting the sculpting process. Usually I use liquid green stuff over the armature to help the clay stick to it, but this time I'm using super glue. The clay that I'm using is super Sculpey firm, and there's nothing really too deep about choosing this clay over any other kind of bakeable clay, except that I have a ton of it and I'm trying to use it all up. Behind the scenes, off to the side, I have a ton of reference images that I've gathered. That is helping me a lot because I thought I knew what a horse looks like, but when I started trying to sculpt one, I realized I do not know what a horse looks like. I got to the point where I had the basic shape of a horse down, and then I got rid of all of the smudges and fingerprints with isopropyl alcohol and a paintbrush. Once the horse was all smooth, I gave it a quick bake to make sure that I wouldn't be smudging it as I continued to work on the piece, and then I made an armature for Arwen. I got even more reference photos because it turns out I also don't know what a human looks like. I decided that this diorama was going to be my diorama chance to do forced perspective, and for that reason I thought it would be a good idea to make the figure in the front a lot bigger than whatever was going to be in the background so that I could give the illusion that all that stuff was happening a little bit farther away, closer to the other side of the mountain and the river. I was feeling good about the sculpture, I was just vibing, and then somewhere along the way it started to go downhill, and I genuinely think it started with me trying to attach this sword because everything after that started to be completely diabolical. First of all, I think the hand was too big, and then it broke off and I had to attach it back on with super glue. Basically, the whole build started to, from this point forward, feel like it was kind of over my head. I didn't feel like I actually had the skills to accomplish it anymore, but I was just trying to keep myself afloat and keep my head above water and pull something close to my vision out of this project. I added in a little lump of clay in front of Arwen to be Frodo all hunched over and delirious, and then I put on some of the details like the bridle for the horse and gave it another bake. Sticking this in the oven was a terrifying experience. It came out okay, but I did another one earlier and it completely burnt up, so I was a little bit scared. But I'm using this as a guide to decide where I'm gonna put the mountains and everything, given that I'm gonna do forced perspective. So something I realized about forced perspective is that it really works best when you are limited to 1 or 2 vantage points for the object. When you can have a full 360 of it, like you're gonna be able to have with this one, to be honest, the perspective thing kind of falls apart. But I didn't realize that until after I built it. So right now I'm using a bunch of foam. At first I was just using a ton of different blocks, but then I decided to just do 2 layers and carve this thing up into the mountains that are going to be in the background where the river is going to come out and wash away all of the ring wraiths. Guys, even though I'm a beginner, I'm a professional. So please be careful when you're cutting up different foam and stuff, okay? And if you notice any cuts on my hand, that's just a funny little quirk about me. I just have those sometimes. Okay, so let's move on to painting this thing. I'm using acrylic paint, like I always use on every single build. This is Liquitex brand acrylic paint. It's heavier than normal, and I feel like it covers the pink insulation foam really, really well. So I'm probably going to be using this from now on when I have to build an outdoor scene and I want to cover up this foam. I'm trying to make these dioramas look more polished and also not let them end up like on the floor or under the bed, but I decided to put some chipboard around the edges and paint that black instead of just painting the foam because I thought that would look a lot neater. And now that I'm done with all of this painting, I'm gonna put that aside and let it dry and paint the model of the horse and Arwen and Frodo. We previously established that this was kind of going downhill already and it was starting to feel like a throwaway build in my mind, so I decided to be really fancy and try out some zenithal highlighting. Zenithal highlighting is a fancy term for when you do underpainting that imitates light coming down from the heavens onto the top of your miniature, because it's really hard to achieve that at such a small scale when you actually just shine light on the piece and it tends to look very flat. So you do a pre-shade of the piece beforehand, and then when you paint over it, in theory, that underpainting will come through and help to establish shadows and things like that. Here's the thing. I used very opaque paints, and I think that's my main problem for why the zenithal highlighting kind of just didn't matter and got mostly covered up and kind of smudgy and just didn't work. 100% didn't work. I literally thought I was going to be adding like plus 15 awesomeness to this piece by doing that, but the painting gods called my bluff. But I knew there was one thing that was not going to let me down this time: my 3D pen. I recently got this and I've been trying it out in my past few builds, and I knew that I could use it in this one for a very awesome purpose, making the water horses. So I have this clear 3D filament that's going to go in the 3D pen, and I'm using plexiglass over a stencil of a horse that I just printed out from freepix.com or something like that. I used the picture as a guide for the first half of the horse, and then I peeled that up and just filled in the other half. When I was filling in the shapes of the horses, I tried to keep them very loose and to use small little movements so that it looked like bubbling water at the front of a tidal wave. I also didn't include the full body of the horses because I was going to merge them into the wave, and at the time I was thinking that I was going to make it completely out of UV resin, but I decided to make them mostly out of the plastic and then cover everything with UV resin. I was kind of over it by the time I got to making the ring wraiths themselves, so I just made some tiny little snail looking creatures that I knew I was going to paint black and have be half submerged in the water, so I didn't think it mattered if they were very detailed or not. Once I figured out where I wanted everything to go, it was time to move on to the UV resin. This first layer of resin is just going down as like a glue layer to stick in the ring wraiths and the horses, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put those under the UV light and cure everything in place and move on to the next step. Dun dun dun! It's Allball. Here he is again. I can't work without him being here, but he's usually a good boy and just sits somewhere in the corner. He tries not to get on my cutting mat. I think he's learned by now that that's where all of the work goes down. So now he just kind of, if I fits, I sits himself into the corners around where I'm working. I'm using the 3D pen again here to add some details of the water frothing around the ring wraiths and kind of washing them away, and then I'm adding in the horses. I also realized that I need to have them connect in some way to the water behind them, so I'm using the pen to make a little bit of a ramp up to the horses, and then I'm going to cover all that with UV resin later on. I'm trying to fill in the gaps around the horses as much as possible, but I definitely could have done a lot more and probably should have, because later on when I add the resin, it just kind of goes through all of the gaps. And I'm also adding some waves and some ripples to the front of the diorama. This build was a roller coaster of emotions because right about here I was thinking, oh my goodness, yes, okay, I can see it. This is great. This is really working. This is gonna look amazing when it's done. I am actually a genius. I am like the best artist known to mankind. And I poured the UV resin over the waves that I just created, and then I used a paintbrush to smooth those out, and I was still just thinking, yes, this is good. The waves blended together perfectly, the little lines disappeared, and it looked amazing to me. It really looked like water, which is what I wanted. But then, I don't know what possessed me to decide. Well, I do know what possessed me. I decided that the water should have been more gray. So I went in with paint directly into the UV resin, and that was a little bit of a mistake. The UV resin was more clear. The lines from the PLA filament from the 3D pen blended in with it, and you couldn't see them. But then once the water was a lot more gray, they kind of stood out and looked like noodles in soup or something. This channel is about learning, so I am okay with discovering that that's not something that worked out. But it was definitely a little discouraging to get this far and then start having things fall apart. And when I say fall apart, I mean literally. Everything started to break. Let's look back over our life and see what things we did wrong and try to just move on from there. I ended up adding some super glue and attaching the tail that had broken off, and I thought to myself, this is probably why it's best to follow the baking instructions on the packets when you use any kind of bakeable clay, because I think it was a little brittle since I didn't bake it at the correct temperature. I started second guessing myself after that, and I added on these clumps of foliage that I thought looked good, but then I started adding on sawdust because I wanted a different texture, and my plan was to paint over all of it with my airbrush. So I tried to use the airbrush, but I blew pretty much all of the foliage off again, and then I just went over it and painted it with black paint using a paintbrush. And at this point, I was really happy. I felt like I fixed all of the problems, but there was one last thing. The horses didn't stand out enough, so I went in with some blue mixed into some UV resin, and then it was way too blue, so I went in with some white. And here is where we ended up. Now's a good time to take a moment to shout out my patrons. Without you guys, this channel literally couldn't exist, so thank you so much for being patrons of the channel. And this is a big shout out to Fred, Lori, Nicole, Awkward Burb, Jordan, K and Z, Ryan, AJ, Beverly, Cheryl, Cheryl R, Crystal M, Fatal Gift, Gabriel K, Grouchy Old Man, Isaac, Julia, Kip, Lizzie, Naomi, Pat, Sheila, and Suki. After talking so much trash about this piece, it turns out I actually love it. I think it was exactly what I was going for in my head, and even though I had a lot of issues along the way, I feel like I kind of recovered from most of them really well, and it's still a really good piece. So I'm excited. Thank you guys for watching, and if you want to see more videos from me, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!